Alexander Volkov moved through the opulent casino in Monaco like a shark in crystal-clear waters, his tailored suit, the subtle glint of a Patek Philippe watch, and the easy smile he offered the beautiful women who graced his path were all meticulously crafted illusions. Beneath the veneer of sophistication lay a man whose currency was chaos, whose ambition was measured in megatons, and whose conscience was a long-forgotten memory. He was the jet-setting arms kingpin, a moniker earned through decades of brokering destruction, a title he wore with a chilling pride. Tonight, the stakes were higher than ever. Volkov wasn't merely selling weapons. He was orchestrating a symphony of global destabilization. His next deal, whispered about in hushed tones in intelligence circles, involved a weapon of unimaginable power, a suitcase-sized EMP device capable of crippling entire nations. Its potential for devastation was absolute, and the parties vying for its possession were a rogues gallery of international pariahs. A North Korean general desperate to flex his nation's power, a Chechen warlord seeking to reignite a frozen conflict, and a shadowy organization known only as the Syndicate, whose motives were as inscrutable as their reach was vast. Volkov paused by a roulette table, casually placing a stack of chips on black. The wheel spun, a microcosm of the global chaos he was about to unleash. He wasn't driven by ideology or greed. Not entirely. There was a perverse artistry to his work, a thrill in manipulating the world's chess pieces, in watching empires tremble at his command. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a necessary evil, a catalyst for change, however destructive. His phone vibrated. A coded message confirmed that his buyers were en route. He excused himself from the table, his smile widening ever so slightly. The clock was ticking. Within 24 hours, the EMP device would change hands, and the world would be teetering on the brink of global war. The conflict in Ukraine would be seen as a playground squabble. The tensions in the South China Sea would boil over. The world would be plunged into darkness, all thanks to Alexander Volkov. He descended into the casino's underbelly, a labyrinth of hidden passages and secure rooms. This was where the real business was conducted, far from the prying eyes of tourists and the watchful gaze of law enforcement. Here, in the heart of Monaco's glittering facade, the fate of the world hung in the balance, orchestrated by a man who believed he was above morality, above consequence, above the very laws he was so expertly exploiting. The gears were in motion. The dance of destruction was about to begin, and nobody, not yet, knew how close the world was to the precipice. While Volkov orchestrated his deadly game in Monaco's high-roller suites, Marcus Thorne was miles away, knee-deep in the grimy underbelly of Marseilles. The air hung thick with the smell of diesel and desperation, a stark contrast to the perfumed air of the casino. Thorne wasn't wearing a tailored suit. His attire consisted of faded jeans, a worn leather jacket, and a 5-day stubble that did little to conceal the hard lines etched onto his face. He was a ghost, a shadow, a man who had willingly relinquished the privileges and protections of his former life. Once, Marcus Thorne had been one of MI6's brightest stars, trained in the art of espionage, a master of disguise, a lethal weapon in Her Majesty's Secret Service. But that was before. The mission in Chechnya went sideways, before the betrayal, before the woman he loved was caught in the crossfire. Now, he was a rogue, a pariah, operating outside the law, driven by a singular, all-consuming obsession. Alexander Volkov. He sat in a dimly lit backroom of a dockside bar, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey. The room was filled with the murmur of hushed conversations, the clatter of dice, the scent of stale cigarettes. Around him were faces etched with hardship, men and women who lived on the fringes, for whom survival was a daily battle. These were Thorne's sources, his informants, the people who saw what the authorities missed. That a wiry man with a scarred face approached Thorne's table. "Heard anything?" Thorne asked, his voice a low growl. The man nodded. "Volkov. He's in Monaco. Big deal going down. Something about a weapon. Something that could make a lot of people disappear." Thorne's eyes narrowed. Monaco.it was always Monaco. The playground of the rich and corrupt, the perfect stage for Volkov's twisted theatrics. He knew, with a gut certainty, that this big deal was the one he had been dreading, the one that could plunge the world into chaos. His obsession with Volkov wasn't just professional. It was deeply personal. Volkov had been his mentor, his friend, his brother in arms. They had served together in countless operations, navigating treacherous landscapes, facing impossible odds. But Volkov had betrayed him, sacrificed him, left him for dead, and in doing so, he had unleashed a force of vengeance that knew no bounds. Thorn finished his whiskey, the burning liquid a small comfort against the cold dread that gripped him. He knew what he had to do. He had to stop Volkov. No matter the cost, he was willing to cross any line, break any law, sacrifice everything to bring the arms kingpin to justice. Or perhaps, he admitted to himself, it was less about justice and more about revenge. The line between the two had blurred long ago. He was operating outside the law, he was alone, but he was coming for Volkov. Monaco was about to get a whole lot more complicated. While Thorn was bracing for a collision course with Volkov in Monaco, Inspector Isabelle Moreau was battling a different kind of war in the sterile confines of Interpol headquarters in The Hague. Her battlefield wasn't the smoky backrooms of Marseilles or the glittering casinos of Monaco, but the endless paperwork, the bureaucratic red tape, and the political maneuvering that often hampered effective law enforcement. Isabelle Moreau was the antithesis of Marcus Thorn. Where he was a shadow, she was a beacon of integrity. Where he operated outside the law, she was its staunch defender, a rising star in Interpol. She was known for her meticulous attention to detail, her unwavering dedication to procedure, and her fierce commitment to justice. She had a reputation for being incorruptible, a quality that had earned her both respect and resentment within the organization. For years, Moreau had been building a case against Alexander Volkov, painstakingly gathering evidence, tracking his movements, and unraveling his complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts. She knew Volkov was a threat to global security, a cancer that needed to be eradicated. But every time she got close, every time she presented a watertight case to her superiors, she was met with resistance, with delays, with political considerations that seemed to prioritize diplomacy over justice. She sat at her desk, surrounded by files overflowing with evidence of Volkov's crimes. Frustration gnawed at her. She knew he was in Monaco, preparing to sell the EMP device, a weapon that could unleash unimaginable devastation. She had presented her findings to the Director General, outlining the imminent threat and requesting authorization to launch a full-scale operation. But her request had been met with skepticism and caution. Inspector Moreau, the Director General had said, his voice measured, "We understand your concerns, but Mr. Volkov is a very powerful and influential man. We need to tread carefully. We cannot afford to provoke an international incident." Moreau had argued, pleaded, even threatened to resign. But her words had fallen on deaf ears. The bureaucracy had won again. She was trapped, bound by the very rules she had sworn to uphold, unable to act while the world teetered on the brink of disaster. Suddenly, her phone rang. IT was a secure line, reserved for sensitive communications. "Moreau," she answered, her voice curt. "Inspector," a voice on the other end said, "We have a situation. A rogue operative, former MI6, is heading to Monaco. He has a history with Volkov. We believe he intends to intervene." Moreau's heart sank. A rogue operative. This was exactly what she didn't need. "Who is it?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Marcus Thorn," the voice replied. "He's your problem now, Inspector. We're assigning you to work with him. Your mission is to stop Volkov, by any means necessary, and keep Thorn in line." Moreau stared at the phone in disbelief. Work with a rogue? Abandon procedure? It was unthinkable. But she knew, deep down, that she had no choice. The world was about to change, and she was about to be thrown into the deep end. She was regulation, and he was rogue, and together, they were Europe's last hope. The EMP device, codenamed Blackout, was more than just a weapon. It was a digital doomsday machine. Contained within a seemingly innocuous aluminum briefcase, it housed a miniaturized high-powered microwave generator capable of emitting an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to fry the electrical grids of entire cities, plunging them into darkness and chaos. IT could cripple communication networks, disable transportation systems, and send economies spiraling into collapse in the wrong hands. It was a tool for unparalleled destruction. And those hands were precisely who Volkov had chosen as his clientele. The North Korean general, known only as General Ri, represented a regime, desperate for leverage in a world that increasingly ostracized them. Your mission is to stop Volkov, prevent the sale of the EMP device, and neutralize the threat. I don't care how you do it, but you will do it together. Du Bois turned to Thorne. Mr. Thorne, you will respect Inspector Moreau's authority and adhere to her directives. Within reason that we are all on the same side here. Thorne smirked. Within reason. I like that. Moreau shot him a withering look. This was going to be a long mission. She could already feel the migraine building behind her eyes. She was regulation, and he was rogue, and somehow, they had to find a way to work together, to trust each other, to save the world from Alexander Volkov. The briefing ended with a strained silence, broken only by the clinking of Thorne's whiskey glass. The unlikely partnership had begun. Monaco shimmered under the Mediterranean sun. A deceptive facade of wealth and privilege. Thorne, blending seamlessly into the crowds of tourists and high rollers, navigated the city's underbelly with practiced ease. Moreau, confined to her makeshift command center in a discreet hotel room, tapped into Interpol's vast network of surveillance and intelligence. Their methods were worlds apart, but their objective was the same, to penetrate Volkov's defenses and uncover the truth behind his impending deal. Thorne started with his contacts. A network of informants cultivated over years of operating in the shadows. He frequented the back alleys, the smoky bars, the clandestine gambling dens where information was currency. He spoke in whispers, exchanged coded messages, and offered favors in return for scraps of intel. He learned that Volkov had tightened security around the casino, that he had brought in a new team of mercenaries, and that the deal was scheduled to take place within the next 12 hours. Moreau, meanwhile, focused on the digital realm. She accessed satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and analyzed financial transactions. She discovered a series of suspicious payments flowing into Monaco from offshore accounts linked to the syndicate. She also uncovered evidence of collusion between Volkov and several high-ranking officials within the Monegasque government, politicians, police officers, and even members of the royal family. The more they dug, the deeper they descended into a web of corruption that threatened to engulf the entire principality. They discovered that Volkov had been using Monaco as a base of operations for years, laundering money, trafficking weapons, and bribing officials to turn a blind eye to his activities. He had built a fortress of impunity, protected by a network of powerful allies who were willing to do anything to maintain the status quo. One name kept surfacing in both Thorne's underworld contacts and Moreau's digital investigations. Jean-Pierre Du Bois, a prominent businessman with close ties to the Monegasque elite. Du Bois was a key figure in Volkov's network, a facilitator who smoothed the way for his illicit activities and provided him with access to the highest levels of power. He was also, Moreau discovered with a sinking feeling, Director Du Bois's cousin. The revelation sent a chill down her spine. Was her own superior compromised? Was she operating in a system that was rotten to the core? She knew she had to be careful, that she could trust no one. She shared her findings with Thorne, who was less surprised but equally concerned. Corruption is like a virus, Inspector, Thorne said. It spreads quickly and silently. You have to cut it out before it infects everything. They realized that they were facing a much bigger challenge than they had initially anticipated. They weren't just trying to stop Volkov. They were trying to dismantle an entire network of corruption that had taken root in the heart of Monaco. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in hostile territory. But they were determined to succeed, no matter the cost. The infiltration had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The decision to tail Jean-Pierre Du Bois proved to be a turning point, and a chaotic one. Thorne, ever impatient, insisted on a direct approach, despite Moreau's protests. They needed concrete evidence of Du Bois's involvement, and Thorne believed the only way to get it was to follow him, to see where he led them. Du Bois left his opulent villa overlooking the harbor in a sleek black Bentley, and Thorne, driving a nondescript rental car, fell in behind. Moreau, monitoring the situation from the command center, fed him real-time updates on traffic patterns and potential escape routes. The chase began sedately enough, winding through Monaco's narrow streets, but it quickly escalated when Du Bois realized he was being followed. He slammed on the accelerator, weaving recklessly through traffic, his Bentley's powerful engine roaring. Thorne, adrenaline pumping, matched his speed, the rental car struggling to keep pace. Moreau, her voice tight with anxiety, urged him to break off the chase. Thorne, this is reckless. You're going to get someone killed. He's leading us somewhere, Inspector, Thorne replied, his eyes fixed on the Bentley ahead. I'm not letting him get away. The chase spilled onto the waterfront, where Dubois abandoned the Bentley and leaped onto a waiting speedboat. Thorne, without hesitation, commandeered a nearby yacht, ignoring the protests of its startled owner. The yacht's powerful engines roared to life, and Thorne gave chase, the speedboat slicing through the waves. Moreau, now monitoring the chase via satellite imagery, watched in horror as the two vessels engaged in a high-speed game of cat and mouse. Weaving through the crowded harbor, narrowly avoiding collisions with other boats, Thorne, displaying a surprising level of nautical skill, expertly maneuvered the yacht, closing the distance between them finally. He managed to ram the speedboat, disabling its engine. Dubois, scrambling to escape, jumped onto a nearby buoy, clutching a waterproof briefcase. Thorne, not wanting to risk a firefight in the crowded harbor, ordered the yacht to circle the buoy, trapping Dubois. It's over, Dubois, Thorne shouted. Give us the briefcase. Dubois, his face contorted with rage, refused to comply. He hurled the briefcase into the water, hoping to destroy the evidence. But Thorne was too quick. He dove into the water, retrieved the briefcase, and hauled Dubois onto the yacht. Back at the command center, Moreau examined the contents of the briefcase. Inside, she found a series of documents outlining the details of the EMP device sale, including the exact time and location, 2,300 hours, beneath the Casino de Monte Carlo. They had their target. You got your information, Thorne? Moreau said, her voice still laced with exasperation. But at what cost? You nearly caused a major accident. You damaged a yacht. You broke countless laws. But we got the information, Inspector, Thorne replied, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. That's all that matters. The chase had been chaotic, reckless, and utterly unorthodox. But it had also been successful. They now knew when and where Volkov's deal was going down. The clock was ticking as Moreau meticulously planned their assault on the casino. Thorne found himself haunted by memories, flashbacks that clawed at his resolve and fueled his burning desire for revenge. He sat alone in the safe house, the city lights of Monaco blurring through the window, and the past came rushing back. The year was 2015. Location, Grozny, Chechnya. Thorne and Volkov were a team, the best of MI6, tasked with infiltrating a Chechen terrorist cell and preventing them from acquiring a shipment of Stinger missiles. They were young, ambitious, and believed they were making a difference. Their mission was complicated by the presence of Anya Petrova, a beautiful and resourceful Russian intelligence officer who was working undercover within the terrorist cell. Thorne had fallen for her instantly, drawn to her intelligence, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. They had forged a bond in the crucible of danger, a love that blossomed amidst the chaos of war. Volkov, too, had been drawn to Anya, but she had chosen Thorne, a decision that had planted the seeds of resentment in Volkov's heart. As the mission progressed, Thorne and Volkov uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Russian government. They discovered that the Stinger missiles were intended not for the Chechen terrorists, but for a false flag operation designed to justify a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They had to stop it, but their cover was blown. They were trapped, surrounded by enemies. Volkov, faced with a difficult choice, made a calculated decision. He betrayed Thorne and Anya, sacrificing them to protect the mission and secure his own advancement. He orchestrated a rescue operation that was nothing more than a staged execution. Anya was caught in the crossfire, killed by friendly fire. Thorne, wounded and heartbroken, barely escaped with his life. He watched in horror as Volkov, seemingly grieving, delivered a eulogy for Anya, praising her bravery and dedication. That was the moment Thorne realized the true extent of Volkov's treachery. He had not only betrayed him but had also murdered the woman he loved. From that moment on, Thorne's life had been consumed by a single purpose: to avenge Anya's death and bring Volkov to justice. He had left MI6, unable to stomach the lies and the cover-ups that he had gone rogue, operating outside the law, tracking Volkov across the globe, unraveling his network, and waiting for the opportunity to strike. Now that opportunity had arrived. Volkov was within his grasp. He could almost taste the revenge. But he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He couldn't let his personal vendetta compromise the mission. The fate of the world was at stake. The flashback ended, leaving Thorn shaken but resolute. He knew what he had to do. He had to put aside his grief, his anger, his desire for revenge, and focus on the task at hand, stopping Volkov from unleashing the EMP device and plunging the world into darkness. He owed it to Anya, he owed it to himself, and he owed it to the world that as the clock ticked closer to 2,300 hours, Thorn and Moreau stood outside the Casino de Monte Carlo, the glittering facade a stark contrast to the grim reality that lay beneath. The casino was teeming with people, oblivious to the impending danger, their lives about to be irrevocably altered. "Ready?" Moreau asked, her voice tight. Thorn nodded, his face grim. "As I'll ever be." They had a plan, a fragile alliance forged in the fires of necessity. Moreau had coordinated with a small team of Interpol agents, positioning them around the casino, ready to provide backup if needed. Thorn, meanwhile, had armed himself with a silenced pistol and a few essential gadgets, relying on his skills and instincts to navigate the treacherous terrain ahead. They entered the casino, a whirlwind of flashing lights, clattering chips, and hushed conversations. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, expensive cigars, and desperation. They moved through the crowds, two lone figures on a collision course with destiny. According to Dubois's documents, Moreau said, consulting her earpiece, the entrance to the bunker is located behind a restricted area in the casino's maintenance section. They made their way to the back of the casino, past rows of slot machines and roulette tables, attracting curious glances from security guards and gamblers alike. Thorn, using his knowledge of the casino's layout, led them through a maze of corridors, eventually reaching a steel door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." He produced a lockpick, a skill honed over years of operating in the shadows, and quickly disabled the electronic lock. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit service corridor. "This is it," Thorn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entrance to the bunker should be just ahead." They proceeded cautiously, their senses on high alert. They could hear the muffled sounds of voices and machinery, growing louder with each step. They reached a heavy steel door, reinforced with multiple locks and security cameras. "This is going to be tricky," Moreau said. "We need to disable the cameras and bypass the security system without raising an alarm." Thorn had a different idea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small explosive charge. "Thorn, what are you doing?" Moreau hissed. "You'll alert everyone." "We don't have time for subtlety, Inspector," Thorn replied, attaching the charge to the door. "Sometimes you just have to make a statement." He detonated the charge, the explosion echoing through the corridor. The steel door buckled and splintered, revealing the entrance to the bunker. Alarms blared, and red lights flashed. "Well, that's one way to do it," Moreau said, shaking her head. "Let's go." They stormed into the bunker, guns drawn, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The time for subtlety was over. The deal was about to go down, and they were the only ones who could stop it. But as they entered the bunker, they knew they had to trust each other, to set aside their differences, and to fight as one. The fate of the world depended on it. The bunker erupted in chaos. Alarms blared, red lights pulsed, and heavily armed mercenaries swarmed to intercept Thorn and Moreau. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of gunfire. Thorn, a whirlwind of controlled violence, moved with lethal efficiency. He used the limited cover to his advantage, taking down mercenaries with precise shots from his silenced pistol. His movements were fluid, instinctive, honed by years of training and combat experience. He was a predator, a ghost, a force of nature. Moreau, while not as physically imposing as Thorn, was equally deadly. She relied on her tactical knowledge and her quick thinking to outmaneuver the enemy. She used the bunker's layout to her advantage, creating choke points, setting traps, and coordinating her movements with Thorn. She was the strategist, the planner, the one who kept them alive. They fought back to back, a seamless team despite their contrasting styles. Thorne provided the brute force, while Moreau provided the finesse. They were a force to be reckoned with. The mercenaries, however, were not pushovers. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and highly motivated. They fought with a ferocity born of loyalty and greed. They were determined to protect Volkov and his precious cargo. The battle raged through the bunker, a brutal dance of death and destruction. Thorne and Moreau fought their way through a series of corridors, each one more heavily guarded than the last. They used grenades, flashbangs, and their own bodies as weapons, pushing forward inch by bloody inch at one point. Thorne was pinned down by heavy fire. Moreau, without hesitation, charged into the line of fire, drawing the mercenaries' attention away from Thorne. She took a bullet to the shoulder, but she didn't falter. She continued to fight, buying Thorne the time he needed to flank the enemy. Thorne, enraged by Moreau's sacrifice, unleashed a furious barrage of gunfire, taking down the remaining mercenaries with ruthless efficiency. He rushed to Moreau's side, checking her wound. "You okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'll live," Moreau replied, gritting her teeth. "Just keep moving. We're almost there." They pressed on, their bodies battered and bruised, their spirits undaunted. They could hear the voices of Volkov and his buyers in the distance, the final act of the deadly transaction about to begin. They burst into a large chamber, the heart of the bunker. Volkov stood in the center of the room, surrounded by his remaining guards and his dangerous clientele. General Ramzan Kadyrov, and a shadowy figure representing the syndicate. The EMP device, codenamed Blackout, sat on a table, its potential for devastation radiating through the room. The final confrontation had begun. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and Thorne and Moreau were the only ones who could stop it. The final chamber was a scene of controlled chaos. Volkov, ever the composed conductor, surveyed the room with an almost detached amusement as Thorne and Moreau burst through the doorway. His buyers, however, were less sanguine. General clutched his pistol, his eyes darting nervously. Kadyrov, a wild glint in his eyes, seemed almost eager for the fight. The syndicate representative, shrouded in shadows, remained impassive, a silent observer at a fierce firefight erupted. Thorne, his movements a blur of lethal precision, engaged Volkov's remaining guards, drawing their fire. Moreau, still wounded, provided covering fire, targeting key individuals and disrupting their formations. But they were outnumbered. Volkov's men, desperate to protect their employer and secure their payday, fought with renewed vigor. One of them managed to flank Moreau, knocking her to the ground and disarming her. Volkov seized the opportunity. He stepped forward, grabbed Moreau, and held a pistol to her head. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Drop your weapon, Thorne, or the inspector dies." Thorne froze, his face a mask of fury and frustration. He knew Volkov was capable of anything. He slowly lowered his pistol, the fate of the world hanging in the balance. Volkov smirked. "Smart choice, Marcus. You always were predictable." He gestured to his men, who quickly disarmed and restrained Thorne. "Now, Inspector," Volkov said, turning his attention to Moreau. "Let's have a little chat, shall we?" He dragged her to a nearby table, forcing her to sit down. His buyers watched with morbid curiosity. "You see, Inspector," Volkov began, his voice soft and reasoned, "I'm not a villain, I'm a visionary. The world is broken, Inspector, it's chaotic, unjust, and unsustainable. The current world order is a house of cards, waiting to collapse." He gestured to the EMP device on the table. This is the reset button. This is the catalyst that will bring down the old order and pave the way for something new. A world where power is distributed, where resources are shared, where everyone has a chance to thrive. "That's insane," Moreau spat, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You're talking about plunging the world into darkness, killing millions of people. A necessary sacrifice," Volkov replied, his eyes unwavering. "Sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. The ends justify the means, Inspector. Surely, a woman of your intelligence can understand that." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're a good woman, Inspector. You believe in justice, in order, in the rule of law. But the law is a tool of oppression. Inspector. It's used to keep the powerful in power and the weak in their place. I'm offering you a chance to break free from that system, to join me in creating a better world. He paused, studying her face. Think about it, Inspector. You could be a part of something truly great. You could help me reshape the world in my image. All you have to do is say yes. Volkov's words hung in the air, a tempting offer laced with a chilling dose of delusion. He believed he was doing the right thing, that his twisted vision of global order was worth the cost. But Moreau knew the truth. Volkov was a monster, a megalomaniac who was willing to sacrifice anything and everything to achieve his twisted goals. And she would never, ever, let him succeed. Volkov, having failed to sway Moreau, turned his attention to Thorn. He signaled his men to bring Thorn forward, shoving him roughly towards the table where Moreau sat. Thorn, his hands bound, glared at Volkov, his eyes burning with hatred. "Look at you, Marcus," Volkov said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Reduced to this. A rogue, a pariah, a broken man, and all because of me." Thorn lunged forward, attempting to attack Volkov, but his guards restrained him. "You killed her, Alexander." Thorn spat, his voice raw with emotion. "You killed Anya." Volkov chuckled. "Anya was a casualty of war. Marcus. A necessary sacrifice. Besides, you were always too sentimental. You let your emotions cloud your judgment. That's why you failed." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you remember Grozny, Marcus? The fear, the chaos, the desperation. Do you remember the look on Anya's face as she realized she was going to die?" Thorn flinched, his face contorted with pain. Volkov's words were like knives, twisting in the wounds of his past. "You could have saved her, Marcus." Volkov continued, his voice relentless. "You could have sacrificed yourself. But you chose to live. You chose to survive. And now you're paying the price." He straightened up, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "You see, Marcus, you and I are not so different. We both believe in a better world. We just have different ideas about how to achieve it. I'm willing to do whatever it takes, to sacrifice whatever is necessary. You, on the other hand, are too weak, too sentimental, too afraid to make the tough choices." He paused, studying Thorn's face. "I offered you a place by my side, Marcus, years ago. You rejected me, you chose Anya. And now you're going to watch as I reshape the world, as I create a new order from the ashes of the old. And there's nothing you can do to stop me." Volkov's words were designed to break Thorn, to shatter his resolve, to make him question his past, his choices, his very existence. He was exploiting Thorn's deepest fears, his greatest regrets, his most painful memories. He was attempting to reduce him to nothing, to prove that he was weak, that he was a failure, that he was no match for Volkov's superior intellect and unwavering resolve. But Thorn refused to break. He had endured too much, suffered too much, lost too much to give up now. He had come too far to be defeated by Volkov's psychological games. He would not let Volkov win. He would not let Anya's death be in vain. He met Volkov's gaze, his eyes filled with a cold, unwavering determination. "You're wrong, Alexander," Thorn said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "We are different and I may have made mistakes. But I have never betrayed my principles. I have never sacrificed innocent lives for my own ambition. And I will never let you destroy the world." He knew he had to find a way to escape, to stop Volkov, to save Moreau, to prevent the EMP device from falling into the wrong hands. He had to find a way to turn Volkov's psychological assault against him, to use his own weaknesses against him. The game was far from over, and Thorn was not ready to surrender. While Volkov focused on Thorn, attempting to dismantle him psychologically, Moreau was quietly assessing her surroundings, searching for an opportunity to escape. She may have been wounded and disarmed, but she was far from defeated. She was a trained investigator, a master of observation, and she knew that even in the most desperate situations, there was always a way out. She noticed that the guards watching her were focused on Volkov and Thorn, their attention diverted by the unfolding drama. She also observed the layout of the room, identifying potential escape routes and points of vulnerability. She saw that the EMP device was connected to a complex network of cables and wires, and that the bunker's ventilation system was located nearby. She knew she had to act quickly, She couldn't let Volkov complete the deal. She couldn't let him unleash the EMP device. She had to create a distraction, to disrupt his plans, to give Thorn the opening he needed to escape and stop Volkov once and for all. Seizing her moment, she feigned a sudden collapse, slumping forward in her chair and groaning in pain. The guards closest to her reacted instantly, rushing to her side. This was the distraction she needed. As the guards scrambled to help her, she kicked out her legs, knocking over the table where she was sitting. The table crashed to the floor, sending glasses and bottles flying, creating a chaotic scene. In the confusion, she managed to grab a broken shard of glass from the floor, concealing it in her hand. She used the shard of glass to cut through the ropes binding her wrists. The ropes were thick and tough, but she worked quickly and silently, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, she was free. She didn't make a run for it. She knew that would be futile. Instead, she focused on sabotaging Volkov's operation from within. She made her way to the EMP device, dodging guards and weaving through the chaos. She used the shard of glass to slash the cables connecting the device to its power source. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the room plunged into near darkness. The EMP device was disabled, at least temporarily. Volkov, enraged by her actions, screamed at his men to stop her, but it was too late. Moreau had already created the opening Thorn needed to end the confusion and darkness. Thorn managed to break free from his restraints. He grabbed a discarded weapon and engaged Volkov's guards, his movements a blur of lethal precision. "Now, Thorn!" Moreau shouted, her voice barely audible above the din of battle. "Stop him!" Moreau's actions had turned the tide of the battle. She had created chaos, disabled the EMP device, and provided Thorn with the opportunity to escape and confront Volkov. She had proven that even in the most desperate situations, a little ingenuity and a lot of courage could make all the difference. With the EMP device disabled and the bunker plunged into darkness, Thorn seized his opportunity. He moved with a speed and ferocity that surprised even himself, taking down Volkov's remaining guards with brutal efficiency. The buyers, sensing the shift in power, began to panic, scrambling for cover or attempting to flee. Thorn ignored them. His focus was solely on Volkov. He tracked him through the chaos. His eyes locked on his prey. He found Volkov near the disabled EMP device, his face contorted with rage. "You can't stop me, Marcus!" Volkov shouted, grabbing a discarded weapon. "This is bigger than you, bigger than both of us." "It ends here, Alexander," Thorn replied, his voice cold and unwavering. The two men circled each other, their movements tense and deliberate. The air crackled with anticipation, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. This was more than just a fight. It was a reckoning, a culmination of years of betrayal, loss, and vengeance. Volkov lunged, firing a burst of gunfire. Thorn dodged the bullets, his movements fluid and instinctive. He closed the distance between them, engaging Volkov in hand-to-hand combat. The fight was brutal and visceral, a desperate struggle for survival. They exchanged blows, each strike fueled by years of pent-up anger and resentment. Thorn's superior combat skills were matched by Volkov's ruthlessness and desperation. They grappled, slammed into walls, and wrestled on the floor. Thorn landed a series of blows, but Volkov retaliated, striking him with a vicious elbow to the face. Thorn staggered back, blood streaming from his nose. Volkov pressed his advantage, unleashing a furious barrage of punches and kicks. Thorn struggled to defend himself. His body battered and bruised, he knew he was reaching his limit, that he couldn't sustain the punishment for much longer as Volkov prepared to deliver the final blow. Thorn saw an opening. He sidestepped Volkov's attack and grabbed his arm. Using his momentum to throw him off balance, Volkov crashed to the floor, his weapon skittering across the room. Thorn stood over Volkov, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. He raised his fist, ready to deliver the killing blow. He could feel the rage building inside him, the burning desire for revenge threatening to consume him. He hesitated. He looked at Volkov's face, his once handsome features now marred by cuts and bruises. He saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation, the realization that he was about to lose. Thorn knew that if he killed Volkov, he would be crossing a line, becoming the very thing he hated that he would be. sacrificing his own humanity for the sake of revenge, that he would be giving Volkov exactly what he wanted. But he also knew that if he didn't kill Volkov, he would be letting him get away with his crimes, allowing him to continue his campaign of destruction, that he would be failing Anya, failing himself, failing the world. That he was faced with an impossible choice, that he had to choose between revenge and preventing global war, that he had to choose between his personal vendetta and the fate of humanity. The weight of the decision threatened to crush him. The weight of the decision pressed down on Thorn, threatening to suffocate him. He stared at Volkov, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw the man who had betrayed him, the man who had murdered Anya, the man who was about to plunge the world into chaos. But he also saw the man he had once admired, the man he had once considered a friend, the man who had once been his brother in arms. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. That he knew what he had to do, that he couldn't let his personal vendetta cloud his judgment, that he couldn't let his desire for revenge compromise the mission, that he had to think of the bigger picture, of the millions of lives that were at stake. That he lowered his fist. He wouldn't kill Volkov, he wouldn't become a murderer, he would bring him to justice, let him face the consequences of his actions in a court of law. But as he lowered his fist, Volkov saw an opportunity. He seized a discarded piece of metal, a jagged shard of the destroyed EMP device, and lunged at Thorn, attempting to stab him in the heart. Thorn reacted instinctively, dodging the attack and grabbing Volkov's wrist. He twisted the wrist, forcing Volkov to drop the weapon. He then delivered a swift, decisive blow to Volkov's temple, knocking him unconscious. Volkov crumpled to the floor, his body limp and lifeless. Thorn stood over him, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had defeated Volkov, but he hadn't killed him. He had made the right choice. Moreau, who had been watching the confrontation from a distance, rushed to Thorn's side. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Thorn nodded, his face grim. "It's over," he said. "He's stopped." They secured Volkov, restraining him and ensuring that he couldn't escape. They then turned their attention to the remaining buyers, who were still scrambling to get away. With the help of the Interpol agents who had arrived on the scene, they apprehended General Ramzan Kadyrov, and the representative of the syndicate. The EMP device, now safely disabled, was secured. The deal was stopped. Global war was averted. The immediate threat had been neutralized. But Thorn and Moreau knew that their work was far from over. They had only scratched the surface of Volkov's network, and they knew that there were many more players involved in the conspiracy. They had a long road ahead of them, a difficult battle to fight, but they were ready to face it, together. They had forged an unlikely partnership, a fragile alliance built on trust and respect. They had proven that even the most disparate individuals could work together to achieve a common goal. As they stood in the bunker, surrounded by chaos and destruction, they knew that they had made a difference. They had saved the world, at least for now. But they also knew that the fight for justice was never truly over. The forces of darkness were always lurking in the shadows, waiting for their opportunity to strike, and they would be ready to face them, whenever and wherever they appeared. The aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. Interpol agents swarmed the bunker, securing the scene, collecting evidence, and escorting the apprehended buyers to waiting vehicles. Paramedics tended to the wounded, and forensic teams began the painstaking process of piecing together the events that had transpired. Volkov, still unconscious, was taken into custody. His reign of terror finally brought to an end. Whether he would face justice in a court of law or manage to escape and become a future threat remained to be seen. His network was vast and well-funded, and he had powerful allies in high places. As for Thorn and Moreau, they stood apart from the chaos, their bodies battered and bruised, their minds reeling from the events of the night. They had achieved their goal, but at a great cost. They had saved the world, but they had also been forced to confront their own demons, to make difficult choices, and to cross lines they never thought they would cross. "It's over," Moreau said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." Thorn nodded, his face grim. "Yeah, we did." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of their accomplishment. They had started as reluctant partners, driven by different motivations and employing different methods. They had clashed at every turn, their contrasting styles and approaches creating friction and tension. But they had also learned to respect each other, to appreciate each other's strengths, and to compensate for each other's weaknesses. They had forged an unlikely partnership, a fragile alliance built on trust and mutual respect. You know, Moreau said, breaking the silence, I still don't approve of your methods, Thorn. You're reckless, impulsive, and you have a blatant disregard for the rules. Thorn chuckled. And you're rigid, inflexible, and you rely too much on bureaucracy. But somehow we managed to make it work. We did, Moreau agreed, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. We may have different ways of doing things, but we both wanted the same thing, to stop Volkov and prevent global war. Maybe that's all that matters, Thorn said, his gaze meeting hers. Maybe the ends really do justify the means. Moreau hesitated. I'm not sure I can go that far, she said, but I will admit you were right about some things. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to get the job done. And sometimes, Thorn added, you need someone like you to keep you from going completely off the rails. They shared a look, a silent acknowledgement of the grudging respect that had developed between them. They were two very different people, from two very different worlds, but they had found common ground in their shared mission, their shared commitment to justice, and their shared determination to make the world a better place. The unlikely partnership had somehow worked. The sun began to rise over Monaco, casting a golden glow on the city's glittering facade. The chaos of the night before was slowly fading, replaced by the familiar rhythm of everyday life. The casino was being cleaned, the streets were being swept, and the world was slowly returning to normal. But for Thorn and Moreau, nothing would ever be quite the same. They had faced death, confronted their own demons, and forged an unlikely partnership that had saved the world. They had come a long way from their initial animosity, their contrasting styles and approaches, their mutual distrust. They had learned to respect each other, to appreciate each other's strengths, and to rely on each other in the face of danger as the Interpol agents prepared to transport Volkov to a secure facility. Thorn turned to Moreau. Well, Inspector, he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I guess this is goodbye. Moreau nodded. Her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and regret. I suppose so, she said. Thank you, Thorn. You saved a lot of lives tonight, including mine. You did your part too, Inspector, Thorn replied. You're a good cop. A damn good cop. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And you, Moreau said, you're a unique individual. I still don't approve of your methods, but I can't deny that you get results. Maybe we'll work together again someday, Thorn said, his eyes twinkling. If the world needs saving, and you need someone to bend the rules a little. Moreau smiled. Don't hold your breath, she said. I have a lot of paperwork to catch up on. They shook hands, a brief but meaningful gesture of farewell. And then, Thorn turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows from which he had come. He was a ghost, a shadow, a rogue agent who operated outside the law. He didn't belong in Moreau's regulated world, with its rules and protocols and bureaucratic red tape. He had a new purpose now. He would continue to track down the remnants of Volkov's network, to dismantle the corrupt system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. For so long he would continue to fight for justice, in his own way, on his own terms. Moreau watched him go, a sense of melancholy washing over her. She knew that she would probably never see him again. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of chaos and destruction. But he was also a hero, a savior, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything to protect the world from evil. She turned and walked towards the waiting Interpol vehicles, her steps firm and resolute. She was returning to her regulated world, to her paperwork and her protocols and her bureaucratic red tape. But she would never forget what she had learned from Thorn. She would never forget the lessons he had taught her about the importance of bending the rules, of thinking outside the box, of trusting her instincts as she climbed into the vehicle. She glanced back at the spot where Thorn had disappeared. A faint smile played on her lips. Perhaps, someday, their paths would cross again. Perhaps, someday, the world would need saving again. And perhaps, someday, she would be willing to bend the rules just a little bit further. The possibility remained, a faint glimmer of hope in a world that was often dark and uncertain. The end.